Whether you're into comedians roasting each other's life choices or turning yesterday's bad decisions into today's funny stories, Amazon Music's got the most ad-free top podcasts, included with Prime. Download the Amazon Music app and get in on the joke. Or go to amazon.com/ad-free-comedy. That's amazon.com/ad-free-comedy to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hello and welcome to the Deathcast. I'm your host, author, and journalist Ian Tott, and I'd like to thank you for joining me as we prepare to take our second look at Jeffrey Dahmer. Before we get going, as always, I have the normal show notes. If you'd like to follow me on social media, just search for the Deathcast. If you'd like to help support the show, there's a couple of ways you can do this. First and foremost, you can go to your favorite podcast app, follow the show, and leave a 5-star review. Not a 1-star review. Nobody needs to know that you're a fucking asshole. Secondly, you can go to tinyurl.com/DCast Patreon, where for as little as $1.99 a month, you can get access to early ad-free shows and exclusive content, just like my first 2 Patreon members, Channel and Anthony, did. As well as my largest Patreon contributors monthly, Samantha, Debbie, Matt, and Betty. Again, that's tinyurl.com/DCast Patreon. Alright, now that all that's out of the way, find yourself a nice comfy chair, kick back and relax. I got my coffee, I've got my cigarettes. Let's go into the crypt! We left off last time with Jeffrey Dahmer having committed his first murder in July of 1978. That was the murder of 19-year-old Stephen Hicks. Now, quick correction from last episode. I incorrectly stated that Dahmer had dug up Hicks's body during this period of time, denuded it of flesh, and then smashed the bones. This actually occurred later, as we will get into very shortly. Now, Dahmer later stated after his capture that Hicks's murder was the only one that really haunted him. There was a period of time where he would find himself uncontrollably crying over what had occurred. And it really wasn't so much that Dahmer had murdered the young man and taken his life, as it was there was this fear inside of him that he was going to get caught. In the fall of 1978, Lionel Dahmer and his new wife Sherry discovered that Jeffrey was living in the house on Bath Road with only the dog, and basically just spending his time drinking. This concerned them greatly. The couple ends up moving back into the house, trying to get Jeffrey to do something with his life. However, it becomes pretty apparent early on that this is not going to happen, as Dahmer spends the majority of his time moping around the property and the house and drinking. So the Dahmers decide that Jeffrey is going to go to college, and they end up enrolling him at Ohio State University, something that he is not interested in, but they really don't give him a choice in the matter. This is going to be short-lived, however, as Jeffrey is just not interested in participating in higher education on any form or facet. His roommates would later state that he spent his time drinking and destroying things inside of the dorm room, to the point that they complained to the school, who told them that they cannot do anything until after the semester ends. So after 3 weeks at Ohio State University, the Dahmers learn of the things that Jeffrey is doing, and he is quickly brought back to Bath, Ohio, where again it's the same old situation. Dahmer spends his time drinking, passing out, and wandering around the property. Eventually, Lionel and Sherry have enough, and they make another decision for Dahmer. that he is going to join the United States Army. Dahmer seemed to do well under the structure of boot camp with alcohol not available to him. However, once alcohol becomes available to Jeffrey, things change, his whole demeanor changes. Those who are in his boot camp class, already thinking him a weird, quiet, withdrawn individual, realize that this guy's got a problem with drinking. But somehow Jeffrey Dahmer makes it through boot camp and ends up going to school where he is designated as a medic. Knowledge that Dahmer is going to end up using over the coming decade once he is out of the military and living with his grandmother. Jeffrey Dahmer ends up getting assigned to number 268 Armored Division, 2nd Battalion, and is stationed in Baumholder West, Germany, arriving in June of 1979. We don't know a whole lot about what Jeffrey Dahmer got into while he was in the Army, other than the fact that many of his Army brethren thought that Jeff was weird, couldn't understand why he showed zero interest in girls, and spent the majority of his time getting drunk. Some of those who knew Jeffrey Dahmer during this period of time have stated that as the months progressed that he was there, they thought that there was a possibility that Jeffrey might in fact be gay, although they weren't going to ask him about this. Instead, they set about trying to help Jeffrey lose his virginity by taking him to a prostitute, and while the others participated, Jeffrey did not. He was seen as a loner who was perpetually depressed. In his own words, Dahmer said that the majority of his time spent in Germany involved going for walks and seeing what he could find. Dahmer still found some semblance of peace when he was out in nature. In addition to this, he found that he was fairly good at shooting and would spend time at the practice range firing .45s or any other gun that he could get his hands on. When not partaking in any of these activities, Dahmer was usually dead drunk. There is a story concerning Thanksgiving of 1979 that does need to be examined. A more senior member of the battalion by the name of Carlos Cruz invited a number of the soldiers to he and his wife's house. In addition to Jeffrey Dahmer, there were numerous other young men there, one whose name is listed in most accounts as Preston. As the story goes, as all of them are eating dinner, it begins to snow heavily outside, and Cruz and his wife suggest that all of the soldiers spend the night there. They were all amicable to this. However, Jeffrey ends up getting into an argument with an individual whose last name is given as Davis. The story states that Davis told Dahmer that he might as well walk back to their barracks, which is exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer decides to do, leaving the Cruz household at roughly 10:30 p.m. The men become concerned and start looking for Dahmer, but they are unable to find him, and as the snow gets worse, they eventually call off their search for Jeffrey. About 4 hours later, according to Cruz and the others who were there, Jeffrey Dahmer returned to the Cruz household. Davis is said to have exclaimed, "Here's the orphan." Dahmer was described as being confused and vague about his whereabouts, and the men noted that he seemed to be preoccupied with something else. In addition to this, they also noticed that his jacket was not particularly wet or cold. Dahmer went into the kitchen where he is said to have washed his hands quite thoroughly. The man whose home it was, Carlos Cruz, would later state that he believed he saw blood on Jeffrey Dahmer's clothing while they were standing in the kitchen. And when Cruz tried to ask Dahmer questions, Dahmer sat down at the table and simply told him that he could not remember where he had been or what he had done. Although, again, this is according to Cruz, Dahmer said that he assumed he had done, quote-unquote, something bad. The reason that this is of interest is this is the first time we have any story of Jeffrey Dahmer after the murder of Stephen Hicks, where people are stating that he had blood on his clothing and seemed disoriented in a swag and not present to his surroundings. While Dahmer was seen as weird and most individuals thought of him as a possible suicide risk, this raises serious questions as to the validity of the many confessions that Jeffrey Dahmer would later give to authorities. If it is true that he showed up at the Cruz household with blood on his clothing, there is a possibility that there may be other victims out there of Jeffrey Dahmer, or it is also possible that he was lying when he said he never took the life of an animal and that he had found some hapless animal and murdered it. There is also the possibility that Carlos Cruz added the detail about blood on Jeffrey Dahmer's clothing, as this story did not come out until after Dahmer was arrested, in an effort to make the story that he was telling in the media more juicy and possibly raise the amount of money that these media outlets were willing to give him to talk about his brief association with Jeffrey Dahmer. People will do these types of things, making up stories to make them seem more important, as well as make the story that they are telling more compelling. We saw this, as a for instance, in the case of Ted Bundy, where Debbie Harry, the former singer of Blondie, came out with this outlandish tale of how she had been picked up by Ted Bundy and noticed the doors in his car had no means of opening them. Reality is, during the period of time she said this story had taken place, Ted Bundy's whereabouts are very well known, as were his movements, and it is not possible that Debbie Harry ever encountered Ted Bundy. It was just a good story to keep her name in the press. It's very possible that this is a similar situation, as Jeffrey Dahmer never confirmed or denied this story. We will never know the actual facts of the matter, because there are no missing person reports from that night, nor are there any reports available stating that a body of either a human or an animal were found around this point in time. Jeffrey Dahmer's time in the military was fairly uninteresting, with the exception of the fact that Dahmer's alcoholism continued to progress, and let's be honest, Jeffrey Dahmer was an alcoholic. He exhibited all of the traits of an alcoholic. He craved alcohol to help blot out whatever semblances of being a normal human being existed within his mind. His alcoholism progressed to such a point that Dahmer began drinking while he was on duty, and this is eventually going to lead to an early dismissal from the United States Army. Roughly 6 months before his scheduled release date, Jeffrey Dahmer is sent back to the United States in March of 1981 for debriefing in South Carolina, and given a voucher to travel anywhere within the United States for free. Dahmer ends up choosing Florida as his destination, as he did not want to return at this point in time to Ohio. According to Dahmer, he thought that being in a place like Florida might help improve his outlook upon life and his general demeanor. Lionel and Sherry Dahmer had no idea that Jeffrey was discharged from the Army until the trunk containing all of his belongings arrived at their house in Bath. Dahmer ends up in Miami Beach, where he takes a room at a motel and a job working at a local sub shop. Dahmer stated that he worked 7 days a week at this shop, and all of his money at this point was spent on alcohol. We know Dahmer found nothing of satisfaction or fulfillment in Florida, with one exception. He ends up becoming friends with a British girl who was in the United States illegally on an expired visa. We know that this young woman at one point asked Jeffrey if he would marry her so that she could stay in the United States, but Jeff showed no interest in marrying her whatsoever. Dahmer, because of his growing alcoholism, ends up homeless, living on the beach. Dahmer later stated that during this point in time, the fantasies that he had about murdering men, possessing their bodies, were nearly all consuming, and no matter how much he drank, he simply could not blot them out. Eventually, after 6 months, Jeffrey Dahmer is forced to contact his family, let them know where he is at and what is going on. Obviously, Lionel and Sherry are not happy with this situation, but they agree that Jeff can come home for a short period of time. And it's at this point in time, with Jeff back in Bath, Ohio, that he goes and digs up the remains of his very first victim, Stephen Hicks. He takes the trash bags containing Hicks's body out into the woods and proceeds to denude them of any remaining flesh, at which point Jeffrey Dahmer smashes the bones into powder and spreads them about the woods. Dahmer later said that his thought process was that in doing this, the crime could never be linked back to him, but also the thoughts of Hicks, which continued to haunt him, specifically the idea that he would be captured for this crime one day, would leave him if there was nothing left to be discovered. Beyond that, Dahmer seems to have busied his time in Bath by doing various tasks around the house for Lionel. One notable instance is the fact that Dahmer insulated the crawl space where he had originally kept Stephen Hicks's body. However, Dahmer's ambling aimlessness in life and continuing struggles with alcohol were quickly to create an issue for him. He ends up being arrested outside of a bar about 2 weeks after his return home for being drunk and disorderly in public. This is really the first of many brushes with the law that Jeffrey Dahmer is going to experience over roughly the next decade, with each brush with the law becoming increasingly more serious. Lionel and Sherry Dahmer decide that Jeffrey just cannot stay with them any longer, and Jeffrey is sent to live with his grandmother, that would be Lionel's mother, in West Allis, Wisconsin. Dahmer was not exactly thrilled with this idea of living with this older woman. However, he really had no other options, so in December, Jeffrey goes and moves in with her. Dahmer later stated that although he had misgivings at first, eventually he warmed to the idea of living at 2357 South 57th Street in his grandmother's home. When talking about his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, Jeffrey, who was never able to say whether he loved her or not, stated, quote, "I guess she's what you could call a perfect grandmother, very kind, goes to church every Sunday, easy to get along with, very supportive, loving, just a very sweet lady." Dahmer basically took care of the household chores, such as mowing the lawn and shoveling the walks when it snowed, while his grandmother took care of the meals. He said that he would spend his evenings watching television with her. Not long after moving in, Jeffrey gets a job working at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, which basically meant that Jeff was drawing blood from blood donors. This period of time is kind of unremarkable. Jeffrey goes to work, helps his grandmother around the house, they watch television at night. He is still tormented by the thoughts that have been plaguing him since around the time of puberty. In January, he goes to Milwaukee and buys a .357 snub-nose Magnum. Dahmer basically used the gun for target practice, as he had, as discussed earlier, picked up target shooting while he was in the military, and it was something that he seemed to actually enjoy. Lionel Dahmer, however, finds out that Jeffrey has this gun and takes it from him, something that I find rather interesting, as Dahmer is a full-grown adult at this point, and it shows you just how controlling Lionel Dahmer was of his oldest son. Dahmer ends up selling the gun in Ohio. At some point during all of this, Jeffrey gets the idea in his head of wondering what human blood tastes like. Remember, he's working at a plasma center, so Dahmer steals a vial of blood from work, goes up to the roof, and drinks it. Jeffrey later said that he did not actually like the taste of it, so he spits it out, and that he had only tried it as a curiosity. Jeffrey tried to link his interest in the drinking of human blood to something else that was going on in his personal life. Jeffrey Dahmer had discovered the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey and had decided that he too was a Satanist, and in his mind, at least the conscious part of it, he thought that the drinking of human blood was something that a Satanist would do. Some have speculated that Jeffrey Dahmer was attempting to find an area where he belonged in this dabbling in Satanism. On August 7th of 1982, Jeffrey Dahmer is arrested again, this time for disorderly conduct. Jeffrey was at the Wisconsin State Fair, and in his own words, he had been drinking and needed to urinate. The problem with this is that there were an estimated 25 people present when Dahmer decided to pull his penis out and begin urinating, including children. This is the first of Dahmer's known acts of exhibitionism. However, it is not going to be his last. Dahmer later said that he realized that this arrest would more likely than not bring shame to his grandmother, so instead of giving her address, he gave the address in Bath, Ohio, where Lionel and Sherry Dahmer lived. Jeffrey later stated that it was this incident that made him resolve to try and turn over a new leaf. Not long after this, Jeffrey Dahmer is fired from his job at the Plasma Center due to poor performance. According to Dahmer, this didn't bother him that much, as he really didn't like the job and the pay was terrible. After this, he and his grandmother traveled to Bath, Ohio for Thanksgiving with Lionel and Sherry, and Upon returning to Wisconsin, at least according to Jeffrey, he began devoting a lot of time to his grandmother in an effort to change his ways. He would go to church with her, read the Bible with her, and as well as on his own. Of this period of time, Dahmer said, quote, "I was reading the Bible then, trying to get my life straightened around, and I'd give some money to the street people sometimes, or send it into different missionaries." Jeffrey stated that all of this had a profound effect on him, as the thoughts that had once consumed him, particularly in regard to Stephen Hicks, seemed to fade into the background of his mind. He also was able to control his sexual urges, cutting down his masturbation to a single time a week. Again, this is all coming from Jeffrey Dahmer, so we have to take all of it with a grain of salt. Jeffrey ends up getting a job working at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee as a mixer, which allowed him to help his grandmother out financially. Prior to this, Jeffrey had mostly been paying his room and board by doing manual labor around the house. However, at this point, he begins to give her $300 a month, working the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 nights a week. Dahmer stated that while life was boring during this period of time, which lasted roughly 2 years, an encounter in the West Allis Public Library changed everything. According to Jeffrey Dahmer, he was reading a book when an individual walked by him and dropped a note on the table. Upon opening it, Dahmer read these words, quote, "Meet me in the second-level bathroom, I'll give you a blowjob." Dahmer did not go and take this individual up on his proposition. He later stated that it was a scenario that continued to play itself out over and over again in his head, slowly eating away at his determination not to give in to the desires within his mind. This is evidenced by the fact that Dahmer began to masturbate more frequently, while his attendance at church began to fall off, and Jeffrey Dahmer began to drink on a more steady basis. He later said that during this period of time, he realized that he needed to find a willing sexual partner, although he was unsure of how to do this, as he was unsure of what types of emotional demands such a partner might require of him. Jeffrey Dahmer later stated that he was not looking for a long-term lover, simply someone to have a sexual encounter with. This is in turn going to lead Jeffrey Dahmer to discover the gay sex shops in Milwaukee, where he stated he bought a lot of pornographic material, just as he had done while living in Germany. He also discovered the peep booths, which were basically closet-sized rooms where he could go in, drop a quarter into a machine, watch a few seconds or a few minutes of a stag film, and relieve himself. Jeffrey Dahmer said that during one of these trips, he discovered that there was a back room in one of these shops wherein an individual could go in, encounter another individual in total or near total darkness, and have a sexual encounter with this individual that involved no form of emotional bonding or personality, which is exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer was looking for. He wanted that sexual encounter, that release of urges, without any form of commitment or the possibility of emotional entanglement occurring. This is fairly common for serial killers who are sex-based in their desires. They have no emotions and therefore want no emotions given back to them from the people they choose as a sexual partner. Ergo, they target an individual who is appealing to them, take what it is that they want from that individual along with their life, and there is no fear of becoming attached to this person. They are simply a body there to live out their fantasies upon. Dahmer also returned to exposing himself to people in public. He estimated that he had done this somewhere between 6 to 12 times before he eventually is going to get caught. So we can see a spiraling of Jeffrey Dahmer during this period of time where he's allowing his darker inhibitions to take control and throwing himself wholeheartedly into them, as he's discovered that he can do these things to relieve whatever form of mental anguish he is undergoing without fear of any sort of interpersonal relationship developing between himself and his intended target. And this is all leading up to Dahmer's discovery of a store mannequin in Southridge, Wisconsin. Jeffrey's fantasies had always revolved around a immobile individual. Simply put, a body that would just lie there and allow him to live out his sexual fantasies. Upon spying this mannequin in 1984, Jeffrey decided that he had to have it. And with this in mind, he ends up concealing himself inside of the store one evening. According to Dahmer, quote, at about 11 o'clock at night, when everyone was gone and the store was locked up from the outside, I went out and undressed the mannequin, and I had a big sleeping bag cover. I put it in that, zipped it up, and carried it out of the store, which was a pretty dangerous thing to do. I never thought of them maybe having security cameras or being locked in the store, but I walked out with it and took it back home. I ended up getting a taxi and brought it back and kept it with me a couple of weeks. I just went through various sexual fantasies with it, pretending it was a real person, pretending that I was having sex with it, masturbating and undressing it. Jeffrey's grandmother is going to discover this mannequin and ask him about it, to which Jeffrey is going to lie, telling her that he had purchased it. However, seeing that she was upset that he had it, Dahmer ends up getting rid of the mannequin, later telling interviewers that it would have been much better had he simply stuck to mannequins and not progressed towards what is going to become his killing spree. Again, according to Jeff, things progressed fairly rapidly. We know that at one point his 18-year-old brother came to stay with him and his grandmother. They ended up spending the night together in a bed, and that at some point during the night Jeffrey attempted to touch his brother, which David was not at all interested in. As we move into 1985, Jeffrey discovers the bathhouses in Milwaukee. Basically a place where homosexual men would go to have encounters with other homosexual men. If you recall the series I did on former disgraced British MP Cyril Smith, he too was known to have frequented bathhouses, although Smith used these bathhouses as an opportunity to abuse boys, as did many of his cohorts. Dahmer said of these bathhouses that he enjoyed having intercourse with individuals so long as he was the dominant person, that is, the individual who was fucking the other person, when he had to play the submissive role and allow the other person to anally penetrate him, he did not enjoy it. Quote, I trained myself to view people as objects of potential pleasure instead of people, instead of seeing them as complete human beings. Sound callous, and it is, but that's what I did. I looked at it as an exercise of taking. There wasn't any mutual giving, not in my mind anyway. I was always quite selfish, unquote. With this newfound release, Dahmer began to broaden his horizons. We know that in June of 1986, he visited a doctor for the first time and obtained sleeping pills. We also know that he got 2 more prescriptions from this same doctor, with the stated reason being that he needed them to sleep as he was working night shift and he found it very difficult to adjust. Now, after getting these 3 prescriptions from this doctor, Dahmer then goes to another doctor and tells the exact same story. This doctor, in turn, starts to give Dahmer sleeping pills. This is really the start of Jeffrey Dahmer's modus operandi, as he's going to use sleeping pills to knock out his potential partners so that he can then use them as he sees fit, without them being able to resist him or decline his advances. Dahmer would go to the bathhouses, find a partner, give them a drink that had been laced with the sleeping pills, at which point he would have his way with them. We know that at least 12 individuals succumbed to this method. Eventually, the bathhouses around Milwaukee are going to learn what Dahmer is doing, and all of them revoke his memberships to their establishment, effectively freezing Dahmer out of going to the bathhouses and having sexual encounters. However, he was not deterred. Instead, Dahmer took to picking up men in the gay scene around Milwaukee, bringing them to hotel rooms, at which point he would give them a drink that was laced with narcotics, and then he would go and perform sex acts upon them. Dahmer later stated that in doing this, he felt as though he owned the victim. Oftentimes, he would lie next to them, placing his head on their chest to hear their heart beating, or on their stomachs, where he could hear their stomachs working. To Jeffrey Dahmer's line of thinking, this meant that the person belonged to him totally then, not just the outside, but the insides as well. And we can see here that he's really starting to live out his fantasies, and that these fantasies are growing more and more depraved. He's not content to simply have an individual's body. He's now beginning to believe that in order to fully own them, for them to belong to him, he must have their insides as well. Dahmer later stated in interviews that his fantasy life really began to explode around this point, as he was able to find individuals and use them as he saw fit. But as his fantasies began to expand, they grew darker and darker in nature. Really, what Jeffrey Dahmer was looking for was a sex slave who would not move while Dahmer did the things that he wanted to them, but also an individual who would never leave him. And obviously, this is going to further fuel his nocturnal adventures. Now, his grandmother was unaware of the things that Jeffrey was getting into while he was not at home. We do know that she expressed on more than one occasion that she felt it was unchristian of Jeffrey to be so nonchalant about his life, and to be out doing God knows what with God knows who at all hours of the day and night. However, Jeffrey was not to be dissuaded in his adventures. No one was aware of the fact that Jeffrey had mentally moved beyond the point of fantasizing and carrying out these fantasies and was now contemplating upping the game. He was no longer feeling content in having a partner who could leave, and he resolved that he would go and dig up a freshly buried corpse with which to live out his fantasies. We know that Dahmer scanned local newspapers looking for such an opportunity, and that at least once he found one. However, when he went to the graveyard that evening to try and disinter the body, he was unable to get through the hard-packed soil and ended up giving up on the idea. After this experience, Dahmer would say that he encountered a rather infamous movie called Faces of Death. If you've never seen Faces of Death, it's stock footage of autopsies, etc., with clips inserted purporting to show real acts of violence. However, many of these clips are suspect in nature. Dahmer stated that certain scenes in this film held an eerie fascination for him, such that when renting the movie, he would rewind these scenes over and over again, unable to explain to himself or to others why these scenes entranced him so heavily. It is pretty obvious, however, with hindsight, that Dahmer was looking for that perfect victim, even if he never admitted it to authorities after his arrest. That during this point in time, 1986, he's emboldened by the fact that he has gotten away with one murder and all of the other various things that he has done to partners, and is now, in his own mind, contemplating combining the two experiences into one, in which he will have complete control over the individual's body, outside as well as inside, but also over whether they live or die. Despite all of this, however, these activities that Dahmer is getting up to secretly, he is still out and about committing acts of an obscene nature, exposing himself to people. We know that during 1985, at least twice, he was cautioned by police for various behaviors. And then in September of 1986, two boys were standing on a bridge overlooking a river. They saw a man standing down by the riverbank with his pants around his ankle and his shirt pulled up to expose his stomach, furiously masturbating. The boys went to the police and reported this incident, giving an accurate description of Jeffrey Dahmer. The police then put out a APB on this individual, and soon enough a squad car saw Jeffrey Dahmer, pulled it over, put him into the back of the car, and brought him back to the river, where the two boys were able to identify him as the man they had seen masturbating. Dahmer ends up being charged with lewd and lascivious behavior and indecent exposure. Dahmer claimed in court that he was not masturbating and was instead urinating, unaware that he was being witnessed by anyone. However, this defense does not stand up in court, and he ends up being convicted on March 10th, 1987 of disorderly conduct. Dahmer ends up getting 1 year's probation, as well as being told that he has to undergo psychological counseling. Dahmer ends up going to these counseling sessions. However, as time goes on, he becomes less and less active in them, eventually refusing to speak with the psychologist at all, simply turning his chair away from her and sitting there in silence until the 50 minutes, which he was paying for, was up, at which point Dahmer would leave and go about his life. So while he is upholding the court order in spirit, in actuality, he is not participating in it, as Dahmer does not want to change his behavior or gain any real insight into himself and why he is doing the things that he is doing. In addition to this, Dahmer is told to undergo numerous psychological evaluations, and while he was somewhat truthful with this particular individual, he would lie on numerous occasions to them, telling them that he had had a girlfriend when he was in high school, that he had used a prostitute on at least one occasion while stationed in Germany, and that he had continued this practice upon returning to the United States. On November 20th, 1987, while he's in the midst of all of these psychiatric evaluations and psychiatrists' visits, Jeffrey Dahmer has a chance encounter with his man that is going to alter the course of his life further. That is the night that Jeffrey Dahmer meets a 25-year-old man from Michigan named Stephen Tiomi at one of the many bars that line South 2nd Street in Milwaukee. After the bar closed, Dahmer sees Stephen standing outside on the sidewalk, and the two men began speaking to one another. When Dahmer suggested that the two of them go get in a room over at the Ambassador Hotel, Stephen, who had no plans for the rest of the night, readily agrees. According to Jeffrey Dahmer, he has no recollection of what occurred that night. They arrived at the hotel, and Dahmer later stated, the next thing he knows, he's waking up, it's the morning, and he's lying on top of Stephen. It's apparent to him that Stephen is dead as the man's head is dangling off the edge of the bed, with blood coming from the corner of his mouth. Dahmer stated later that upon inspecting Tiomi's corpse, he saw that the man's chest was heavily bruised, and it was apparent to him that Tiomi's chest had actually been beaten in, to the point that the bones inside of his chest were actually sticking through the skin. Dahmer said he sat there for a moment trying to assess the situation, looking at himself and finding that his hands were covered in bruises as well. Recalling this, Dahmer states, quote, I felt complete shock. Just couldn't believe it. Shock, horror, panic. I just couldn't believe it happened again after all these years when I'd done nothing like this. Dahmer said that he placed Stephen's corpse into the closet of the hotel room and spent the next 5 hours pacing the hotel, chain-smoking cigarettes as he sought a way out of this situation. Again, according to Dahmer in later statements to the police, quote, it's almost like I temporarily lost control of myself. I don't know what was going through my mind. I have no memory of it. I tried to dredge it up, but I have no memory of it whatsoever. Dahmer was able to recall that he and Stephen had been drinking rum and coke that evening. However, he was unable to find the bottle, and this panicked him greatly as he feared that he may at some point during the night have opened the door to put the bottle outside, and that somebody may have looked inside the hotel room and either seen what he was doing or else seen the aftermath of what Jeffrey Dahmer had done, which in his mind meant that there was a possibility somebody could link him to Stephen, who was now dead. In the early afternoon, Dahmer ends up going to a nearby Woolworths and buying a suitcase. Returning to the Ambassador Hotel, Dahmer places the body of Stephen inside of it. He then books the hotel for another evening, and later that night, calls a taxi cab, at which point Jeffrey Dahmer goes down from the hotel room carrying the suitcase that has Stephen's body inside of it with him. The taxi cab driver helps Dahmer put the suitcase into the trunk of the car. They then drive to Jeffrey's grandmother's house, where he sneaks inside and places the suitcase in the basement. After this, Dahmer ends up taking 2 days off of work, Monday and Tuesday, before returning on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. While he's at work, his father, stepmother, and brother arrive for Thanksgiving. Dahmer gave no outward appearances to anyone present that anything was out of the ordinary. Now, alone in the house for a period of time, Jeffrey Dahmer turns his attention to the body that's in the basement. Dahmer had purchased a knife with which to dismember Stephen Tiome's corpse, and he proceeds to do this, cutting off the head, opening up the stomach, denuding the body of flesh as best he can, and placing these pieces inside of plastic Ziploc bags that he had purchased for the occasion. Dahmer used an old sheet to wrap the bones of his victims inside of, at which point, much as with his first victim, he smashes the bones into powder. Dahmer then puts all of this into trash bags. He said the entire ordeal took about 2 hours to complete, and early that Monday morning, Jeffrey Dahmer sneaks the remains of Stephen Tome out of his grandmother's home and places them into the trash. However, Dahmer did not dispose of every part of Stephen's body. By his own admission, he kept Stephen's head for another 2 weeks, boiling it to remove the flesh as well as the brains and anything else that could rot, before wrapping Stephen's skull in a blanket and placing it on the top shelf in his closet, where he knew his grandmother would not find it. Eventually, though, Dahmer ends up destroying the skull as well and disposing of it. Dahmer later stated that Stephen's murder was the real turning point in his life, that he realized that there was no point in trying to fight the dark impulses that lay inside of him, and instead he would simply go with these impulses and do that which he wanted to do whenever the desire, the compulsion to take a human life arose within him. To quote Dahmer, "One thing I knew for sure, it was a definite compulsion because I couldn't quit. I tried, but after the ambassador, I couldn't quit. It would be nice if someone could give me an answer on silver platter as to why I did all this and what caused it, because I can't come up with an answer. By that time, my moral conscience was so shot, so totally corrupted, that was my main focus of life. These were my fantasies. That's what happens when you think you don't have to be accountable to anybody. You think you can hide your activities and never have to account for them. It can lead to anything then, which it did." Further quoting him, "After the fear and terror of what I'd done had left, which took about a month or two, I started it all over again. From then on, it was a craving, a hunger. I don't know how to describe it, a compulsion, and I just kept doing it, and doing it, whenever the opportunity presented himself. And this is really how the mind of a serial killer works. As they progress, they go through that cooling off period, which we've talked about numerous times, until the thought of taking a human life returns to them and begins to build upon itself to the point that they can no longer resist the urge and must act upon it in order to satiate the unsatiable beast that lives inside of their minds. After this murder, Jeffrey Dahmer continued to meet his court-mandated obligations, and by his own account, Once it became apparent that no one was going to go looking for Stephen, the anxiety that he had felt at being discovered subsided. In January of 1988, Dahmer met a black man at a local bar, brought him back to his grandmother's house, and drugged him, at which point he masturbated over the man's body 4 times. However, no further acts of violence were perpetrated against this individual. However, this reprieve was not to last. On January 17th, 1988, Dahmer left one of his normal haunts, the 219 Club in Milwaukee, and went to a bus stop, at which point he noticed a young boy standing there. This individual, a 14-year-old Native American by the name of James Dox Tater, Dahmer approaches James and offers him $50 to come and spend the night with him. Dahmer takes James to his grandmother's house. According to Jeffrey, after arriving home, he found, as he knew would be the case, that his grandmother was asleep in her room. The two of them went to the living room where they began undressing one another before moving on to heavy petting. Eventually, Dahmer persuades James that they should go down into the basement. At some point, James lets it be known that he's not going to be able to stay for too much longer, as he needs to get home. And it's at this point that Jeffrey Dahmer makes James a drink. Dahmer says that James fell asleep with his head in Jeffrey's lap, before saying, quote, "I knew my grandmother would be waking up soon, but I still wanted him to stay with me, so I strangled him." After this, Dahmer lay with James's body for a period of time before concealing it in the fruit cellar and returning upstairs, at which point he dresses and joins his grandmother for breakfast. When his grandmother leaves for church, Dahmer brings the body back upstairs into his bedroom and quote-unquote pretends he's still alive. After this, Dahmer places James's body once more in the cellar. He stated that during the course of the week he went to the basement a further 3 times and lay with James's body. When his grandmother began to complain of a smell coming from the basement, Jeffrey told her that it must be the cat litter and that he would take care of it. On the following Sunday, when his grandmother went to church, Jeffrey Dahmer disposed of James's body the same way that he had disposed of Stephen's, keeping James's skull for another 2 weeks before disposing of it. Dahmer later stated that the keeping of the human skull was a way for him to always keep the individual with him. He told psychologists that somewhere along the line, in between the murder of Stephen and James, he had come up with the idea of creating a shrine made of human skulls that he could worship at privately, and that each time he viewed the skull, in his mind, the victim was still with him. Dahmer is in full thrall to his murderous desires at this point. On March 27th of 1988, he meets a man by the name of Richard Guerrero, aged 23, at one of his favorite bars. As with James, he meets Richard on a Saturday night, offers him $50 to spend the night with him, brings him back to his grandmother's home, but unlike James's demise, they spend the majority of the night in Jeffrey's bedroom, and after making Richard a drink, Jeffrey strangles him before lying with the body. The next day, Jeffrey joins his grandmother for breakfast, but unlike with James, this time he decides to dispose of the body immediately, holding on to Richard's head for months on end. The next weekend, Dahmer has an encounter with an individual who does not end up dead. The story goes that the man was at one of Dahmer's favorite bars. After leaving the bar, he found his car would not start. Jeffrey offers to jumpstart the man's vehicle, provided they go back to his house and get his car. Upon reaching the house, the man hears Jeffrey speaking to his grandmother, letting her know that he's just getting a cup of coffee. The man said that he was off-put by Jeffrey Dahmer and realized that something was seriously wrong. However, he ends up having a cup of coffee with Jeffrey and awakens 2 days later in the hospital with strange bruises all over his body and no recollection of how he got there. Upon talking to the doctors, he learns that he had been found unconscious in a field. Once he is back at his home, this man, Ronald Flowers, realized the number of items he had had with him were missing, that his underwear was turned inside out, and he was also unable to find $200 that had been on his person. Recalling the events of the night he met Jeffrey Dahmer, the man goes to the police, who interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer on April 5th. Dahmer claims innocence, stating that the man had drank too much at his grandmother's home and he had helped him to the bus stop the next day, at which point he had no idea what had become of Ronald Flowers. The police also spoke with Jeffrey's grandmother, who stated that Jeffrey had set a bed up in the basement for his friend and that she had seen both men leave the house together Sunday morning. How Flowers ended up in a field is unknown, but some have speculated that he was so drugged by Dahmer, he simply wandered off the bus at some point and ended up face down in the field, at which point a passerby spotted him and he was taken to the hospital. Similarly, some have suggested that Dahmer did not kill Flowers because Flowers was too physically imposing of a force. I personally believe it has more to do with the fact that Dahmer found he did not want to permanently own this individual and instead decided to let him live after he had indulged some of his fantasies. We are going to leave Jeffrey Dahmer at this point, having committed 3 murders, is now 1988, and he really is just getting started. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this episode, and until next time, stay morbid.